Good afternoon and welcome to Blackfriars. I'm Father Dominic White, I'm the prior here. So welcome, of course, to many of you who are here in person, and I think more online as well. So you're all very welcome, and I'm very excited by this collaboration. It's very appropriate that a synodal conference should be a collaboration between the English Dominicans, the Jesuits, and Georgetown University. So it's also international collaboration too. I'm really looking forward to this afternoon. I've already been a little bit involved in synodal conversations, my work at Margaret Beaufort Institute. Welcome back, Anna. And I think this is something really at the heart of the church, and maybe it's something rather overdue. You know, how do we live together when we are a bit different from each other? How do we share the good things? How do we deal constructively, creatively, because God is creative, with the disagreements? In many ways, it sounds like doing community life on the macro level. So I'm looking forward very much to this afternoon. Thank you all very much for coming. So I'm going to hand over to Tom Banshoff now to introduce the afternoon. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Father Dominic, for those kind words of introduction. My name is Tom Banshoff. I serve as Vice President for Global Engagement at Georgetown University, where I also direct our Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And let me just begin by saying how honored and delighted we are to be partnering with you, with Blackfriars Hall, with Reverend Nicholas Austin, the Master of Campion Hall, a fellow Jesuit institution, on today's conference. I'd especially like to recognize, he's standing there in the back, my friend and colleague Mike Scott, who is based here at Blackfriars and is known to many of you, for his service as a vital bridge between Georgetown, Blackfriars, Campion Hall, and indeed the Oxford community. I want to thank him and Maggie Scott and my colleague from Georgetown, Mary Gordon, for organizing and helping to make our gathering possible. I also want to recognize my Georgetown colleague, Kim Daniels, director of our initiative on Catholic social thought and public life, another sponsor of today's event. It's wonderful to be with all of you this afternoon in person and online. And as you know from our program, we've convened an excellent set of scholars and practitioners to discuss the Synod on Synodality, what it has achieved, what it means, and what lies ahead. In a moment, I'll turn to another collaborator, Austin Ivory, who'll be chairing our first panel. Austin, as you know, is a leading expert on Pope Francis and his pontificate. And in introducing that first panel, he'll provide a little background about the Synod and what has transpired. I thought I'd take a few minutes, though, to step back and share some of the thematic framing for our gathering, really around two core concepts: encounter and conversion. Encounter, as many of you will know, is one of Pope Francis's core ideas. It incorporates the idea and practice of dialogue, but also the imperative of engaging positively with difference. We can think of synodality as a method, a style, a way of proceeding that is in many ways about encounter, bringing diverse points of view together in the service of a common project. It involves disagreement, of course, but in a spirit of mutual recognition, respect, humility, and generosity, in an effort to find common ground and to move forward, recognizing diversity while not falling into division. It's a way to be church, living and sharing the gospel in a world marked by complexity, conflict, and crisis. Now, this is not the church that many of us, especially the older among us, have been accustomed to, a church in which discussion and debate have often been carefully circumscribed. To embrace synodality, a way of being church-centered on participation, communion, and mission, is in many ways a new departure. It involves a conversion, a turn, a faith that acknowledging and navigating inevitable differences, building what Pope Francis calls a culture of encounter, is the right way forward, despite all the difficulties associated with it. We're not talking about a one-time conversion, a radical break, but the start of an open-ended process. Synodality is not something that began a couple of years ago and ended 2 months ago. It's an ongoing project with much older historical roots, and as we look forward together, an enduring legacy of Francis's pontificate. Today, we're very fortunate to have participants in the Synod and leading scholars with us to reflect on what has been accomplished so far, the experience of the two synodal assemblies in Rome in October 2023 and 2024, the work that took place leading up to those gatherings, between those gatherings, and the work that continues and lies ahead. That will be the topic of our first panel, which Austin is moderating, with Tricia Bruce, Anna Rowlands, and Birgit Weiler, along with Kim Daniels. We'll then, after a coffee break, turn to a conversation with two eminent scholars with sociological backgrounds, but also leading theologians, Tomas Halleck and Jose Casanova. And there we'll focus on the wider historical and theological significance of the Synod. And of course, as you know, we're very excited that our afternoon will conclude with a keynote address by Cardinal Timothy Radcliffe, to which we are all very much looking forward. Now, before I turn things over to Austin to introduce and moderate our first panel, please allow me just a few moments to share a brief word about Georgetown University's engagement with this work. We are the oldest Catholic and Jesuit university in the United States, located in Washington, D.C. And over more than 2 decades of the leadership of our president, Jack DeGioia, we've worked with partners around the world, including here at Oxford, to do our best to advance interfaith and intercultural dialogue in the service of peace and justice, very much in keeping with our Jesuit mission and identity. This conference grows out of our Culture of Encounter project, a collaborative effort based at Georgetown's Berkley Center and generously supported by the GHR Foundation, to explore and support this key idea of Pope Francis, the imperative of encounter, of difficult dialogue in the service of the common good, something vitally important in the Church, but also, you'll agree with me, in Washington, D.C., and indeed, across our divided world. President DeGioia, who resigned just last month for health reasons, very much regrets that he can't be with us today as he had very much hoped. But I'm happy to be able to share his greetings with our partners and everyone here. So with that, thank you again for joining us. Like you, I look forward to a lively conversation. Now please join me in welcoming Austin and our first panel to the stage.
First of all, to tell you what it is we're trying to do in this first session, which is about the experience of the synodal journey. Now, I know most of you will be familiar with some aspects of it, but just to remind you, this is a historic kind of synod, a new kind of synod that has itself inaugurated a new model in the Church of the way we do things. It's a new, if you like, instrument of global ecclesial discernment, which has been put into practice over the last 3 years. Beginning in an unprecedented way with a historic consultation of the people of God across the world, the biggest ever consultation carried out of the people of God, and probably the biggest ever consultation in human history. The purpose of that initial stage was for the ordinary people, ordinary Catholics, to come together in parishes and institutions and answer a series of questions about their experience of how the Church works. And it was from the answers to those questions, which were gathered in diocesan reports and in turn synthesized into national synthesis reports, that the agenda of the rest of the journey flowed. So we had the initial what's called diocesan or national phase. It was opened in October 2021, and we then had the beginning of the continental phase, which began with drawing up a synthesis of all of those 118 Bishops' Conference reports. That synthesis document then became the basis of the continental stage, which involved, for the first time, 7 ecclesial assemblies across the world, 7 different continents held gatherings, not just of bishops, but of clergy, of religious, of lay people, of young people, of men and women, delegates of the Bishops' Conference, who discerned and discussed and in turn produced reports. And each of those 7 reports were put together and, you've guessed it, in turn synthesized into, and that became then the basis of what's called the universal stage, which has been October 2023 and this last October 2024 have been the universal stage, 2 synods of bishops, which for the first time ever have included a substantial portion, a quarter in fact, of non-bishops as full voting members of the synod. That assembly, the one that we've just ended in October, concluded with a final document, which now begins the implementation phase. We're now concerned with the implementation of this document. So that's just to outline what it was, and we're here to tell you about how we experienced it. And then in the second panel, we'll look at what it all means, what is its significance. Many have described this as the most significant event since the Second Vatican Council, and indeed the most ambitious attempt to embed the council dynamic in the ordinary life of the Church. And these are the claims that I like to test with our panelists, so that at the end of this session we can better answer the question, how significant was it? What has changed? And obviously it's too soon to say. None of us needs to say that because we all know it. It's too soon. We are embarked on a process now of reception and implementation of the final document, and arguably that is a task that will define this generation. But we have had an experience these past 3 years. There have been transformations. We have seen this new thing in practice, and that's what we want to share. So I'm asking our brilliant experts today to assess that transformation that has occurred these past 3 years within the life of the Church. How well have we articulated a vision of how the Church needs to change its basic way of operating? And to assess what kind of an instrument we've created here for consultation, for discernment, and for decision-making, an instrument which can, of course, be used from now on. And I want to just briefly quote from paragraph 28 of the final document, which itself defines synodality. One of the achievements of the synod has been to come up with, as it were, an agreed definition of synodality. And we have ideas like walking together. We have the idea of mission, that it must involve a constant gathering at all levels of the Church. Very important, the idea of assembling to listen to each other and to listen to the Spirit. The idea of proceeding through establishing consensus, or as it was known in the Synod, convergences, as a way of understanding what the Spirit is saying to the Church. And it's about reaching decisions, it says here, according to differentiated co-responsibilities, which is church speak for meaning we might all differ in the positions we hold or the offices we hold in the Church, but we are all called to take responsibility for the life and the mission of the Church. So we have here notes about participation, about mission, about collaboration, so that the Church can better witness through the relationships in its internal mechanisms and life, can better witness to the gospel. So we are talking here, as Tom said, about a conversion, a process of moving from one model, which one might call quite monarchic or corporate, anyway, worldly, towards one that better reflects the gospel, so that we can better give, as it were, a better witness to the signs of the times. So, having introduced the topic, I now want to introduce our experts. Now, just to explain something, everybody here on this panel has been involved in the synod process in different ways, as I'll explain. But all as experts, that is to say, people assisting the process rather than as members. So a member of the synod is one who has the right to speak and to vote. There were 368 of them at the final assembly, and experts were about, I think, 70, a mixture of facilitators and theologians. So what you have here are experts who have never been far from the engine room from the beginning in different ways. So all, as you see, are women. 3 are lay people, and one of them, to my right, is a religious sister. 2 are American, that's Kim and Tricia in the middle. 1 British, Anna at the end, and Birgit is German, although she's really to be considered a Peruvian because she spent so many years in Peru. So I'm going to ask each of them, I'm going to introduce each one of them, tell you a little about their involvement, and then pass you over to them so they speak to you for about 8 minutes or so, giving their reflections. So, If I can introduce, first of all, Sister Birgit Weiler to my right. She has many, many years as a missionary in Peru. She's a theology professor and synodality expert at the PUC, the Pontifical Catholic University of Lima. Latin America, of course, has been the source of this synodal journey in so many ways. I don't believe it would have happened without a Latin American pope, without the Latin American experience of synodality. And Birgit's been involved even before this process in many synodal processes in Peru, but also at a continental level of CELAM. We were both at the CELAM Ecclesial Assembly in November 2021. Birgit was again in Frascati, helping to draw up the global synthesis document. She helped to put together the synthesis document for the continental stage of Latin America. In February this year, she was named to the Council of the Secretariat in Rome and was involved in drawing up the working document for this concluding Synod Assembly. And now she's part of a commission formed by the Peruvian bishops to change the way the Bishops' Conference of Peru works according to on synodal lines. So Birgit, over to you.
Thank you very much. I beg your pardon for my voice. It is the virus which became more strong. And right now, this is as good as it gets. For us, it is in Latin America and the Caribbean, as we form a unity, it is really a historical moment that so many people who have collaborated generously in the moments of listening to each other, consultation in the synodal journey, really feel like this, express it like this. Why? Because the richness of the theological, ecclesiological concept of the people of God, which has been there since many years for us, also in many basic Christian communities, that we all belong to the people of God, have our place, has been very much strengthened and enriched in its meaning and its consequences during the synodal journey. And also to recover the memory, what it means that we all share into the grace of baptism and the dignity baptism gives to us has been very important. It is very important for the synodal journey for us in Latin America. And it resonated and resonates strongly with us, the word of Pope Francis in the Joy of the Gospel, Evangelii Gaudium, when he says, every renewal of the Church, like this one, essentially consists in an increase of fidelity to her own calling. And like this we perceive our synodal journey. We want to grow in fidelity to the call of Christ. Christ summons the Church as she goes her pilgrim way to that continual reformation of which she always has need, insofar as she is a human institution here on earth. And when I shared with Austin and we saw what could be an aspect to contribute here in the panel, we must say, and I think you can look into your own context, in Latin America, the synodal idea, concept, call, did not fall from heaven, so to say. We started a synodal journey when we now look back and read our history early, and we perceive God's Spirit working here. CELAM, the so-called ecclesia, the council, Episcopal Council for Latin America and the Caribbean, the abbreviation is CELAM, was the first General Episcopal Conference founded at regional level already in 1955. And okay, it is first collegiality among bishops, but they soon asked lay people to become part of commissions, to slowly start to work together. Very important for us, Medellin, 1968, like our Vatican Council too in Latin America and the Caribbean. When we learned, without using the word synodal, to walk together, we asked as a church, who is missing here in our community? And there the option, the preferential option for the poor was born, because indeed they were missing. They were not there present enough. Then in Puebla, when this option was confirmed, and it is beautifully said also in our final document now, if you might have read it, it says the poor are close to the heart of God. We are all close to the heart of God. but they have a preferential love because they are the most vulnerable, the most exposed to that their dignity will be violated. And so in Puebla, it was said, added to the preferential option for the poor comes the preferential option for the young people, and especially those ones living in poverty. So to include more groups. In Puebla already it was said, among the poorest of the poor are the indigenous peoples, and that is not right. It's not right and according to God's will. And it was said, women are suffering in a double way the poverty. That has to change. So we can see we moved on already learning to which human groups do we have to pay much more attention if we want to be the Church of Jesus Christ, where we are called to be all in communion. We also learned that it is so important by walking together to continuously read the signs of the times and let the Spirit speak to us. Certainly a milestone has been the Amazon Synod, which was realized in 2019. Why? Never ever before the Church has listened in such a broad way to indigenous peoples. And they did it in the whole region of the Amazon because they felt very much often left at the side, at the margins, discriminated against, not only in society, but they also felt often not really at home in the Church. Approximately 25,000 people participated then, bringing in their voice. That was for us a very important learning experience, how to organize, how to do the setting that we listen to each other with respect, with attentiveness as brothers and sisters, and that there is freedom of speech. It helped us to discern together what is God calling the Church to in the Amazon region, and the title therefore was that we are open to new ways for the Church and for an integral ecology, so much in need to safeguard the Amazon biome. Again, here you see what has become very strong in our synodal journey and is there in the synthesis document after the first session, is there in the final document, to be together on the way as a synodal church or towards growth in synodality is not just a purpose in itself, but calls us to be at the service of humanity, the service of the world. Then another landmark was certainly what Austin already mentioned, the first ecclesial assembly of Latin America and the Caribbean, but it was the first ecclesial assembly on a regional level in our church worldwide. And what did we learn there? The experiences of the Amazon Synod taught us how to refine the method of listening openly to each other. Pope Francis, in a message he sent to us when the whole process began, he said, please remember, listening is more than just hearing, because listening means that each one has a word to bring in and that we all are learning from each other. So that was beautiful. And he asked us also, when he sent the message just before opening the assembly in Mexico, it was done in a hybrid form, virtually and with presence, physical presence. Then he said, please keep in mind two key things. Listen, listen, listen. And secondly, with an open heart and open mind, open your heart and mind to the transformative love of the Spirit, which takes you beyond what you can imagine, beyond what you dream of. Be open to it. And I think these experiences helped us. Before this assembly, 70,000 people in all of Latin America participated in virtual circles because of the pandemic. We couldn't meet physically, in listening to each other, discerning with each other. What is God's call for the church? Reading the present signs of the times, looking towards the coming 10 years. And so these went into the process in the assembly itself. And the assembly itself met in nearly 100 virtually established groups to discern together and to define the pastoral priorities for the coming 10 years. And then already a lot of attention was given to that they are well mixed, age-wise, culturally, ethnic background, men and women, people from different charisms, different ministries, and that we would learn to really discern together. With this, the priorities were established, and I think that helped us very much to get prepared for what was then the invitation of Pope Francis to the whole Church, the synodal consultations in different moments. What was also special here, Cardinal Gregg and Cardinal Hollerich came to the first Ecclesial Assembly. They wanted to participate, and they told us, we are here to learn. And they took up this idea, let's first begin with listening to each other, not with papers, but with listening. That is why the broad consultation was done. And then was with us also Cardinal Gracious from India and Cardinal Bo from Myanmar. They took it back to their assembly of the bishops and the lay people when they met, and they decided then to change their way to do things, listening, but sitting around round tables. And this inspiration then came into the worldwide process. So what you can see, we can enrich and inspire each other when we are open to this as a synodal church. What have been important points which came up, and we could see they resonated, the topics from our listening sessions all over the church. There was the more participative bodies which effectively will function, and that lay people with their gifts and skills as baptized, as being the ones who also have received the gift of God's Spirit, will be included in decision making and decision taking. That was very strong, and it is there also in the final document. The other one, very strongly there, the plea to please review and redefine the role of women in the church, to find a more rightful place for women in the church was very strong. And to also open up spaces for women to take participation, or to participate actively in leadership roles which are open to them, but often they are not seen, they are not taken into consideration. So that they can freely bring in their gifts, skills and charisms to take the necessary steps to open these spaces, put the means to make this possible, and really in the understanding that this is for the good of the whole church. It's not about a power struggle in the church, but it is that the gifts and charisms which the Spirit is giving so generously to all can be brought in. And thirdly, it was very clear that in Latin America, and then we could see it resonated, it came through and through in the whole church, that we overcome clericalism. But because it was said it is a distortion of the use of power, it causes harm to our relationships of communion. And it was in the clear awareness that we all have to contribute to it, that this mentality is also in us, religious men, women, lay people. And to bring it together, there is really the people said it is a joy that we have learned during this synodal journey, that we are brothers and sisters in Christ. It's a joy to perceive our voices are asked to be brought in, and that we are recognize each other as subjects, not as objects, that we all have something to bring in. The Spirit has given precious gifts to us for the good of the whole church, and that therefore we desire that we continue to grow in heartfelt relationships of friendship, of interdependence, of interrelationality, so that we have a binding together of heart and mind, and that the necessary reformative steps we are taking will help us to grow in this living out synodality, in order to live more fully the gospel values which Jesus is calling us to do so.
Thank you very much indeed, Sister. Beautifully clear. There's only one thing I just wanted to just clarify. She talked there about, and you'll hear this phrase a lot, the decision-making and decision-taking. So one of the things that happened during the Synod was to understand that while the decision-takers in the church remain, the authority structures remain, the process of decision-making needs to be as participatory and discerning and consultative as possible. So next on the panel we have Kim Daniels, who's Director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University, a long-standing member of the Vatican's Communications Dicastery. She's served also on the Communications Commission of this Synod on Synodality. She was involved in the continental ecclesial stage for North America, and she's been at both Synod assemblies in Rome in the concluding stage, October 23 and 24, in various communications roles. Kim is also coordinator of one of the 10 study groups created by Pope Francis to look at particular questions that have arisen from the Synod. So one of the decisions taken was, this Synod can't look at everything, can't do everything. It had to focus on the one issue of synodal conversion. But in order to respect the issues that have come up, these study groups were created. Kim is coordinator of study group 3 on the mission in the digital environment. Kim, over to you.
Thanks, Austin. It's wonderful to be here with colleagues and friends, and now having had some time to catch our breath after the General Assembly in October. I'm grateful to Mike Scott and my Georgetown colleague Tom Banshoff, and to everybody who was involved in organizing this wonderful gathering. Very grateful to you, Birgit, for setting that wonderful context and highlighting a few points as we move forward. So let's get right to it, and maybe I'll start off by highlighting some of the current context that we're in. That's how I'll start. Then I'll offer a brief assessment of the Synod experience as well as some key takeaways from it, and then I'll wrap up with some concluding thoughts. But first, let me give away the ending. The significance of the Synod on Synodality was that it set in motion a process of spiritual renewal and structural reform in the Church so that we can better witness to the gospel in our own time, a time that Pope Francis has called a change of epoch. For that spiritual renewal to grow, we should resist what Pope Francis has called ecclesial introversion, and instead keep our focus firmly pointed outward to seek out and serve our neighbors in need, at the margins, and without a voice. And for that structural reform to take hold, we should respond to the consistent and urgent calls from the people of God around the world as expressed throughout the Synod process and in the final document for increased opportunities for women's participation in leadership and decision-making roles. So first, though, let's set our context. Across the globe, we are being challenged by what Moises Naim calls the 3 Ps: populism, polarization, and a post-truth environment. In the United States, as an example, because that's what I know best, our political and ecclesial context is that of a wounded church and hurting country, suffering from increasing polarization within our family of faith, hostility and division within our politics, and a profound loss of trust in institutions, including our church. Political leaders and movements have exploited all of this to gain power. The rise of social media, the omnipresence of intrusive technology in our lives more generally, the relentless news cycle heightening a sense of crisis, eroding trust, undermining sources of authority, and deepening polarization. And then given the depth of the clergy sexual abuse crisis, it's no surprise to find widespread anger, anguish, and alienation from the institutional church among lay Catholics, both in the United States and around the world. So that was the public and ecclesial context into which Pope Francis launched the Synod on Synodality. It was and is a bold and hopeful effort to put out into the deep, and it's a great story. The world's oldest institution, widely seen in the secular world as stuck in the past and beset with problems, embarking on something new and bold and unprecedented. A global listening process open to everyone and aimed at renewing our mission to live out our mission in our own particular times and places, a mission centered most of all on humble service, as Pope Francis reminds us, to those lying wounded by the roadside. As you know, and as Austin spelled out, the synodal process began in Rome in October 2021 and proceeded through local and national and continental stages of consultation. As Austin mentioned, I was at the opening in October 2021 and participated there in one of the first listening sessions of the process. It's fascinating to look back from this vantage point at that first glimpse of what was to come. I was in a group of 15 or so people that seemed remarkable then, and today, tellingly, seems very familiar. A cardinal and an archbishop from opposite corners of the globe, 3 young people not afraid to speak their mind and hopeful for the future that they want to help build, theologians, lay people, men and women religious from around the world. Now, fortuitously, in that listening session back in October 2021, the young people happened to speak first, and they broke open the conversation right away. No platitudes for them, none of the cautious and careful language of the churchmen, a word that they would find jarring and from another century. Just honesty about their love for Jesus Christ and his church, their hope for the future, and most plainly, their fears of how the church was failing to engage their friends, their neighbors, and their loved ones. In that room, I had my first sense of what was to come over the course of the next 2 years in analogous gatherings around the world. Now let me look to the U.S. for a minute. While many U.S. bishops resisted synodality from the beginning, or at best were indifferent to it, it's important to note that the Holy Spirit was clearly at work and conversions of heart took place among some, and it was very heartening to witness. And in the U.S., the process itself was robust. The diocesan phase included over 30,000 opportunities to participate. All 178 Latin Rite dioceses in the U.S. contributed, and some 700,000 participants played an active part. And now at the same time, it probably won't surprise you to learn that U.S. attitudes and responses to the Synod reflect some of the strengths and divisions within the Church in the United States. There was some enthusiasm, some skepticism, some fear, and a good deal of uncertainty. So here we are in December 2023, after the diocesan, national, continental consultations, 2 general assemblies, with a final document that Pope Francis has approved as an authoritative orientation for the Church's life and mission, and part of the ordinary magisterium of the successor of Peter. So what are some key takeaways from that process? A few stand out to me. First, the genie can't be put back in the bottle. Lay people, women, and others on the margins have had a seat at the table and were a key part of decision-making, a major and long overdue step forward, and going backward should not be possible. Second, the Synod brought home the global nature of our Church. As historian John McGreevy notes, Catholicism has become the most multicultural and multilingual institution in the world. In 1900, 2/3 of the world's 250 million Catholics lived in Europe. Now 2/3 of the 1.4 billion baptized Catholics live in the global South. We can hope that a broader, more global perspective may help dilute the divisions that exist within the Church. Third, Pope Francis' call for a poor church for the poor, central to his thinking for decades, should be at the heart of the synodal project to build a more participatory, mission-centered church. The last phrase of Pope Francis' homily at the closing Mass said it all. Let us stand once more and carry the joy of the gospel through the streets of the world. And let me talk one more about one particular issue to go to number 4, women's roles in the Church. As I mentioned earlier, there were consistent and urgent calls from the people of God around the world, as expressed throughout the synodal process at every phase and in the final document, for increased opportunities for women's participation in leadership and decision-making roles in the Church. It was heartening then that in the final document, it affirmed, quote, that inequality between men and women is not a part of God's design, and called on the Church to pursue full implementation of all opportunities for women already provided in canon law, to continue discernment regarding women's access to the diaconal ministry, to give more attention to the language and images used by the Church, and to give more space to female saints, theologians, and mystics. Now, there were many challenging moments in the Synod around women and our place in the Church. That has to be said. But it's helpful to step back and recognize that we've come a long way in just a few years. I'm thankful to my friend Chris White for the reminder that in 2019 at the Synod on the Amazon, Helen Jeppesen and other women protested outside the Synod because they didn't have a vote. Today, women are at the Synod, we're at the Synod as voting participants and leaders in so many ways. Helena was a voting member and led the organization of an audience with Pope Francis for the women of the Synod. Bishops had the experience of working with women and learning from them, not a regular experience for them in many parts of the world. So I see this as a significant step forward, and I come away very hopeful about the leadership of the women who were involved in the Synod in the years to come. And at the same time, I have to say, of course, we have so much more to do on so many levels. Women involved in the Synod face cultural and institutional challenges at various times throughout the process. There need to be more women in the room for better decision-making, to change the culture of clericalism as a matter of justice, and as a sign to young women that their gifts are valued. But I'm confident that we're moving forward. So let me wrap it up. My overall reaction to the Synod process is one of hope about what is a remarkable moment in the life of our church. Just take a step back. This centuries-old, global, multicultural, multilingual institution of 1.4 billion people came together to listen to each other so as to face our deepest challenges head-on and work to renew our church for the future. That's just unprecedented. This diverse group, women and men, bishops and lay people, lots of human frailties often on full display, all sharing a common faith but many disagreements, managed to come together around a broadly agreed upon set of steps towards reform and renewal. This is a model for the world. And the path forward from here starts with taking the long view. In Pope Francis's words, God sees into the distance. God is not in a hurry. We ought to reflect this patience, particularly regarding a process as complicated and distinctive as this one. And staying comfortable in the tension and messiness of what we are embarking upon will help us resist the impulse to overreact to the inevitable challenges ahead of us. Now, one last way to wrap it up is from a layperson who was not involved at the Synod at all, but he told me what he took away from the whole process. He said, the church is listening. The doors have been opened. The church wants to find you where you're at. It doesn't want to talk to you. It wants to talk with you and to walk with you. I think that's a great summation.
Thank you so much, Kim. I remember one member of one of the round tables talking about the way things had changed in respect of women's place at the table when he overheard the facilitator say, "Excuse me, Cardinal, she hasn't finished speaking yet." He thought that was very symbolic. Thank you very much, Kim, for that fantastic overview. So next on our brilliant panel is Tricia Bruce. She's another American, a sociologist of religion out of Knoxville, Tennessee, who has spent much of her life trying to understand that most mysterious of things, American Catholics' attitudes and behavior. She was invited after the October 23 Assembly, I should say, to be a consultant to the Synod Secretariat and was present in the final assembly as an invited expert. Also wanted to mention, because the issue of women has come up, that she did some important research for Discerning Deacons, which was a US-based group of women who felt called to the diaconate and who were very much present in both of the Synod assemblies. They met the Pope and they held some various events. And she did some important research for them prior to the Synods, which I'm sure we'll want to hear about. So, Tricia, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Metrics of change can be elusive, conversion often so subtle that it requires history more than consciousness of the moment to mark it. Whether and how change occurred are the kinds of questions that plague scholars of social movements, particularly those tracking those areas where gains are less easily measured by changes to the law or other direct actions by the state. The subtitle of my own first book, which looked at lay Catholics' responses to revelations of abuse in the church, was How Voice of the Faithful is Changing the Church. But hanging a signpost on change felt increasingly ironic as revelations about abuse just kept coming, as did further distrust and structural stagnation. I entered my synodal experience and reflection thereafter as a sociologist, especially attuned to the dynamics of change in the church, in particular the U.S. church, as well as the experiences of differences, inequality therein, and interplay of structure and agency that uphold the status quo and what changes it. As a consultor to the General Secretariat of the Synod, I took as my marching orders what at the time was a fairly radical proposition put forth in the documents of Vatican II regarding the value and imperative of social science in the Church. Vatican II urged that we read the signs of the times, to exercise critical judgment, to look at human institutions and cultural patterns. naming the fruits of that heightened awareness we hear in Gaudium et Spes, that from day to day, in every group or nation, there is an increase in the number of men and women who are conscious that they themselves are the authors and the artisans of the culture of their community. I want to pick up on this word conscious and reflecting on change or conversion from the more recent synod on synodality. Consciousness raising is a major component and outcome of the work of social science itself, to name by consequence and activate the underlying human mechanisms of our shared project as a people and a culture, as a people of God. Conscious is also a word with an impressive array of slightly different meanings. Having mental faculties not dulled by sleep, to be awake, to perceive, to apprehend, to notice, to personally feel, maybe even feeling guilt about something, to notice, to express concern, to approach something with critical awareness. The entire Synod experience was arguably an exercise in developing consciousness, both individual and collective, akin to what sociologist C. Wright Mills submits as the sociological imagination. The Synod helped Catholics and the interconnected global Catholic Church connect personal and local struggles, or what Mills labeled personal troubles. I imagine his book is on that shelf over there. I see a number of social theorists, to larger systemic issues, social problems. We heard, for example, from the North American summary stage of consultation that the synodal documents, quote, expanded our consciousness about the realities of life in the church in different places in the world. Sociologists, of course, know that culture is by default often designed to soften consciousness. In other words, to ensure that we, its participants, see norms as taken for granted and the status quo as seemingly unchangeable. Because the opposite, consciousness raising, self-consciousness, can feel unfamiliar, unsettling, off-putting, even anxiety-inducing. It's familiar territory to me as a sociologist, tracking not only Catholics' efforts to decry the underpinnings of abuse, but in studying the experiences of marginalized Catholics in the church, looking at how bishops make room for different kinds of expressions through the use of parishes, listening to women lament their inability to respond fully to their call of service in the church, or to priests articulate their own distrust and fear in a culture still overshadowed by abuse. The Synod process, while far from social scientifically precise, thrusts this kind of consciousness, uncomfortable as it is, into the global church writ large. The synodal process of listening and dialogue operated as essentially tools for building collective consciousness. Increased consciousness, of course, is predicated upon inclusion, or what sociologists would look at as sampling. Who's in the room? Who are you asking? Who's participating? To look at the North American delegation that was nearly evenly split in terms of the representation of men and women who participated in the process along the way, the Synod Hall, of course, likewise welcoming a wide array of participants, albeit not equally split, but including young participants, lay participants, women participants from so many places. This kind of inclusion catapults consciousness. We become aware, we become awake, and we become sometimes uncomfortable. One response to consciousness raising in Synod consultations was anxiety. We heard, for example, from the North American response how profound joy and enthusiasm were experienced by many, while resistance, suspicion, and anxiety were aroused in some. Another named response was fiery communion, a term that emerged from the U.S. summary of consultations for the Synod. A fiery communion that witnesses to a gospel with prophetic zeal. Participants in synodal listening sessions acknowledged that the synodal process has unearthed tensions within our communion. The document for the United States also notes that while this fiery communion can sound discordant, the ardent nature of our diverse communion in Christ is not outside of the tradition. The tensions call for a prophetic response. In other words, an embrace of the fiery communion. I, for one, might have appreciated even more of that fiery communion inside the Synod hall itself. Perhaps the most intense flames that I observed were the ones I nervously watched dance around the edges of paper cup holders when we were all gathered for an ecumenical vigil marking the 60th anniversary of Vatican II. Some of those paper cups actually did catch fire, but no major emergencies. Or the metaphorical fire in the room when many were asking for greater transparency around the work of Study Group 5, charged with exploring women's roles in the church. Perhaps fiery communion was tempered by the decidedly less than gender split composition of delegates and attendees in the hall itself, and the likelihood that any especially diverse group might default to what feels like a less fiery, more safe conversation that maintains the peace. Social theorist Emil Durkheim identifies collective consciousness as forging a sense of belonging and identity as a people. It's how vast difference can present as unity. The Synod boldly attempted to do this, to forge a shared framework and collective sense of responsibility to guide decision-making. The pillars of communion, participation, and mission put forth shared values that fuse pluralist expressions of the local church into unity. And the final doc embeds this consciousness as both process and outcome. For example, in speaking to the sacramental roots of the people of God, alluding back to Vatican II and the full, conscious, and active participation of the faithful. Or looking to deacons who promote within the whole church both of consciousness of service and a particular style of service towards all, especially the poorest. And in a subtle move from conscious to conscience, the document speaks to ecclesial discernment as spiritual practice, whereby each person speaking to their conscience is called to open themselves to others who share according to their conscience. In this sharing, they recognize together what the Spirit is saying to the churches. And for individuals, how God speaks through the personal conscience of each person, which is the most intimate center and sanctuary of a person. And building out into the structure of the church itself and decision-making process behind it, whereby all ought to offer their input honestly, sincerely, with an informed conscience and acting in good conscience, offering thoughts to identify their main points. That shift from conscious awareness to conscience might be where we see the most change, not unlike what we observed with broader social movements around things like Me Too, Black Lives Matters, and other contexts and other places in the world. Places where the social imaginary moves from what was, feeling like it's no longer what is. But the downside, or framed more optimistically, the next steps, require translating and codifying consciousness and conscience into what social theorist Max Weber identified as more rational types of authority, not just cultural, not just conscious-based, things like canon law, organization, and structures. Consciousness alone falls short. We need look no further than the disconnect between the consistent cries for increases in women's roles and pathways that keep those cries at the level of consciousness rather than meaningful change so far. Looping back to the documents of Vatican II, that language of from day to day, in every group or nation, there's an increase in the number of men and women who are conscious that they themselves are the authors and the artisans of the culture of their community. We are the authors and the artisans of the culture of their community. The synodal experience was a radical invitation to consider ourselves as authors and artisans of the culture of our community. And this is the moment, the opportunity then to instantiate that new level of consciousness into ecclesial structures that are indeed welcoming of all. Thanks.
Thank you, Tricia, very much, especially for that link back to the Vatican Council. Very, very important. So last on the panel is Anna Rowlands. She's Professor of Catholic Social Thought and Practice at Durham University, and has been a key theological advisor and expert to the Synod Secretariat in this Synod. She was with us in Frascati, helping to draw up the synthesis of the bishops' conferences across the world. And after that, she was part of the backroom team, the smoke-filled rooms, as some people imagined them, drawing up the working documents for the final 2 stages. So Anna's really been very, very key to the whole process. So she helped prepare those documents, and of course also was key to writing the concluding documents, both of the October 23 and October 24 assembly. So Anna, your reflections.
Thank you very much, Austin, and to Tom. And I'm really honoured and delighted to be sharing a panel with 3 women who have been so central in different ways to the whole of the synodal journey in very different geographical contexts. So the panel itself is a kind of expression of the kind of thing, that, process and reality that this synod has been. So Austin asked the panellists to make some general remarks at the beginning. You'll begin to see a pattern in the way that we've spoken, and then to pick 1 or more of 5 questions to focus on. So I'm going to make some overall very meta comments to begin with, and then I'm going to focus just on one question, which was about the relationship between the original grassroots reports and what was in those reports and the end of the process where we are now. And I'm just going to really drill down into one major anthropological set of questions. So I would frame the experience of the last 3 years as an experience of and development in the ecclesiology of communion, focused on strengthening the communal dimension of the life of the Church for the sake of mission in a bleeding world. If Vatican I developed the ecclesiology of papal primacy, Vatican II, that of episcopal collegiality in the context of the people of God, an emphasis that Birgit has already pulled out, then the Synod has contributed a dynamic theological experience, a lived experience of the communal dimension of our being Church. This is not the proposition of a communal dimension as a rival to or an overcoming of papal primacy or episcopal collegiality, but rather of their more complete extension and articulation, drawing from the inspiration and guidance of both prior councils. A substantial part of the agenda of the Synod was precisely to talk about deepening reflection on the ministry of the Bishop of Rome and of developing a new vision, a renewed vision of episcopal life. Now, when I use the phrase to articulate here, I deliberately mean to invoke the notion of articulation in both the English and the Italian senses of the word. In English, we use the verb to articulate to mean that we give a very clear verbal account of something. In Italian, the verb articolare implies a rather more dynamic, physical movement, akin to the connection of sinews, muscles, bone, and flesh that enable the coordinated movement of the body. This is an important distinction in meaning, partly because I believe that the synodal process has developed iteratively a deepened language for expressing a people of God theology and the communal dimension of discernment and co-responsibility, but also that the learning by doing element of the Synod has developed what I like to think of as almost the muscular memory of synodality, as something learnt in the coordinating action of living and moving together, including the odd experience of joint pain as we have exercised those muscles. For these reasons, I think that the most interesting and significant image of the Synod was the photograph taken just after the final document had been approved by the Assembly and signed by the Pope. It's a slightly chaotic and yet very joyful image of the people of God. You can Google it online if you haven't seen it. It's an image, a very joyful, if slightly chaotic image of the people of God, laity, priests, bishops, religious and deacons, gathered around the Pope, who is in the midst of and not elevated above the people, Compare it to that famous image of Vatican II assembled in St. Peter's, or some of the paintings of Vatican I with the illuminated light of the Holy Spirit focusing on the Pope and the poor bishops left in the shadows. We have not, I think, even really begun to really digest all the implications of that final, joyful, chaotic image. It will take much work and, importantly, raises many theological questions that are worthy of serious discussion and meditation. That's my quick meta-level response to the question of the significance of the Synod. However, I want to say something about this question of the relationship between the grassroots reports and what they originally presented and the consensus fidelium. Now, I am sadly one of the very few people in the world who has read every single grassroots report that was submitted and every individual letter or email that came into the Synod office. So I think therapy rather than applause is what I'll need in the end, but nonetheless. But actually, that's an honour to have read those, and it gives me a real sense of the journey that we've made from those individual submissions to the final document. So in many ways, very much so, the process, including the final document, I think can be proud of itself for giving back pastorally and theologically enriched what was in those reports. And many of these issues have been mentioned already: the cry for greater participation, the call for a greater recognition of charisms and ministries in their diversity, of accountability in the church, and a healing of wounds, especially around abuse of various kinds. Interesting also, and this was there at a global level, but with different cultural expressions, attention to the social divisions that divide the ecclesial body and the way in which those divisions often mirror those in the societies that they're meant to be witnessing to: class divisions, race divisions, tribal divisions, and gender divisions. Also, crucially, the need for pastoral and spiritual accompaniment and formation that is fit for our times. We do not have formation models fit for the whole people of God to serve the needs of our times. A greater recognition of cultural context and the inherent plurality of the church. All of these are beautifully expressed in the grassroots reports, and you can trace them in the final document. What is also true is that the final document gives back to the grassroots material that, interestingly, exceeds what was in the grassroots report. So there are some things in the final document that were not in the grassroots reports at all, really. This includes the significant reflection on the role and place of the bishop, including of episcopal conferences and the role of the Bishop of Rome. Not many people wrote in the grassroots reports that they were concerned about the role of the Bishop of Rome. These were not especially present in those submissions, but they are a very significant and important part of the final document. I think it's worth asking now why they didn't emerge much at the grassroots level, which is, I think, connected to the absence of episcopal and priestly voices speaking for themselves as freely as many of the laity and religious did in the early stages. And we need to ask ourselves why our priests and bishops did not feel that they could speak with the same candour and openness. Nonetheless, and by the way, that's not a criticism of them. Nonetheless, there are questions and topics that were present in the grassroots reports that I think, if we're being really honest, have been harder to address, and that's where I want to drill down now. I'm going to mention one just in a very precise way in passing, and then I'm going to deepen another. So the most obvious single issue to be present in reports at the grassroots levels from all over the globe that did not make its way through with the same emphasis into the final document is the question of the inclusion of people with disabilities in the life of the church. So the disability question is the question that got lost. I think that is rather shameful, and I think that begs some collective ecclesial reflection. I'm not going to deepen that now, but I am going to note in honesty that I know there's a gap between what I read at the beginning and what I read at the end. In a broader sense, the other topics that proved especially challenging were present at the local church level, in the reports, and then were sometimes challenging for the assembly to actually manage to process. Now, these questions present at the grassroots, but that became sometimes difficult to digest by the assembly, I would group them together as what I would call the anthropological questions. So I think the questions that the Synod found most difficult to handle were the anthropological ones. And I think they were the ones that were most difficult to integrate into both the method and the process of the Synod. These concern the requests in almost all reports for greater attention, as has already been mentioned, to the charisms and vocations of women, attention to the just participation of women and women's ministries, and the separate question of human sexuality and gender as pastoral and theological realities that the Church needs to resource the local churches in responding to. And I want to be really clear here about how anthropological questions, particularly about gender and sexuality, were present in the local reports. Many churches were simply asking, not simply for inclusion and welcome, they were asking for formation from a Catholic point of view, high quality spiritual and theological formation, and to be helped to think through the issues and questions as human realities. That's what they were asking for. So if we frame this in a narrow rights way, we're not understanding what was in those original grassroots reports. I would conjecture that kicking Tricia. I would conjecture that the difficulty of handling these questions in the manner that the grassroots reports seemed to request exposed several factors that were in play, and in no particular order. All I've got time to do is list them. A, the poor quality of relationships, not true in all contexts, but true overall, between Catholic theologians and their episcopal conferences. B, significant cultural and ideological divisions within the Church, such that radically different anthropological readings struggled to be in sustained dialogue with each other. C, the dynamics of both fear and distrust. And D, the mirroring of the secular difficulties that we live with in thinking well about these same matters, which also find some analogy in the Church. However, I want to suggest that these two major anthropological areas, talking about the experience and role of women in the Church and talking about wider questions of gender and sexuality, faced, in fact, two slightly different fates in the synodal process. So I'm just going to, in conclusion, contrast the treatment of the two. So the journey on women, this is a good news story on the whole. I think, despite some headlines, that the discussion of the place and role of women fared rather better in general, with significant and interesting progress being made. And Kim and others have already highlighted this. After the first assembly, it was possible to find a language with which to express convergence or divergence, agreement or disagreement on the question of the place and role of women, and to already suggest some concrete positive steps. You can trace that through the various reports. Key to being able to do so was the coalescing of the process around a common language of baptismal dignity. So the framework language that enabled progress to be made between groups who might hold significantly different opinions or views within a Catholic framework still, was the ability to coalesce around a common language frame of baptismal dignity. The argument, therefore, for equality of being and of participation was made in entirely theological terms. The equal place of women in the Church is determined, according to the documents, by baptism. In one sense, this circumvented other theological, anthropological debates that we could have got lost in, some of which, frankly, were suspended rather than resolved, but it importantly allowed a space for common framework and genuinely constructive proposals. Crucially, it also enabled recognition of the failure to implement the current existing provisions that already exist for the participation and co-responsibility of women. In almost every diocese in the world, these basic provisions are not currently being implemented. The injustice of this was frequently noted. Nonetheless, the sticking point, which was not resolvable in the context of this synod on dealing with the question of the place and role of women, concerned the wider theological framing of the meaning of sexual biological difference and its relationship to the shape and form of ministries. Here, competing theological narratives remained without resolution, nor, in a sense, adequate space for expression and development. The most obvious of these, to make things concrete, is the use, for example, and I'm not commenting on it one way or another, I'm just noting the significance of its presence for some, of a Balthasarian, Marian, Petrine framing to the question of ministries and its potentially literalist application to the question of biological sex. The debate on women deacons remains caught precisely in that question, at least for now. By contrast, in conclusion, I would argue that the two assemblies struggled to find an analogous common framework of language to even express agreement or disagreement on questions of sexual identity or orientation. So on women, we found a common language to have the conversation. On questions of gender and of sexual orientation or identity, I would argue that we did not. And that means that there is a fascinating gap between the time that was spent discussing those questions in the small groups during the first Synodal Assembly and its absence from the synthesis report and the final document. The breakdown, for me, is in the transition from the small-scale face-to-face conversations of the Synod, which were rich, to the framing of a common language akin to the one that became possible on the question of women. We did not get there on questions of gender and human sexuality. This implies the need for a depth of theological and pastoral work that the Synod has begun, but not yet resolved or completed. Now, lest that sound a depressing note to finish on, I want to finish with some wisdom from St. Augustine. Augustine reminds us that our life together as Christians is a walking together, but that walking together is, he says, quote, no journey of the feet, but a vision, a way of loving. He says to us that God comes to us not in the strength of our walking, but God comes to us and draws nearest precisely in the weakness of our walking. And this should give us much heart, for we are walking.
Thank you so much, Anna. Please feel free to clap. Thank you, Anna, for that incredibly rich account of what, as it were, happened and what we did well and what we didn't so well. And listening to it occurs to me that we can speak about achievements of the Synod. We can say what the Synod has accomplished. But I don't think any of us would ever want to fall into a kind of triumphalism, because in fact, in many ways, the Synod journey exposed so much about the Church, of course, that needs reform, needs development. And that in itself is one of the gifts of the Spirit. We actually haven't got a lot of time for a freer discussion now. I just want to, because I want to allow time for a Q&A. So in a few minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, I'll come to you and ask if you want to ask a question. So if you feel drawn to ask a question, begin to formulate it now, nice and concise, please. But meanwhile, can I ask the panel, almost to follow up on Anna's assessment there of where the Synod found a common language and where it failed to. Can I just ask you about the role that conversation in the Spirit played in the process? Not just kind of your view of it, but what you heard from the people in the assembly. Conversation in the Spirit emerged as the celebrity, sometimes called actually the Synod method, has emerged as the celebrity method of the Synod, very much based on Ignatian processes of communal discernment, 3 rounds, each one speaks, everybody else stays quiet, a period of reflection while you listen to the resonances in your heart, a second round where you share those resonances, and a third stage where you, as it were, try to come together and find convergences. This was the method used really from quite early on. It was used in the continental assemblies. What was the effect of that? How well did it work? What were its limitations and its successes? Anybody, Birgit, do you want to begin?
I heard many people who said it has transformed me because we learned to listen deeply to each other, to let go of your preconceived ideas or concepts, to really become open so that God's Spirit is working there among us in the interactions. And that it also helped to overcome power struggles in many cases, so that you really could feel what brings us close humanly. Sympathy, empathy, also to better understand from where the other person is coming in her way of looking at reality.
Yeah.
And that this is a very important common ground then to discern which are the steps, the further steps to take.
Thanks. Anybody want to add anything?
Just very briefly, I think to me what I found from it was that it really, or what I saw and observed, was that it allowed real dialogue to take place, right? So that real dialogue is listening. It's not just talking about what your next point is going to be in the conversation, but thinking about what you've heard. It's not some mushy middle. It's sticking to your principles, but at the same time, really hearing and learning from other people. And I think so. Conversations in the Spirit was wonderful in that regard. I think the challenge is going to be translating that to other contexts. So how do we, not every conversation that we have in the church can be a conversation in the Spirit, but how do we translate that synodal action and that experience of seeing others deeply and of hearing people into our everyday conversations in church life? I think that'll be important.
So I would say that the main achievement of conversation in the Spirit is that it humanized us. So it was a mechanism for people to be able to speak and listen to each other for the same amount of time, and crucially, to build periods of silence into the structure of how we listen. So to create a gap between speech and response. And the way in which it creates that gap between speech and response allows a reception of another person which has something quite transcendent to it as a quality. One bishop described it to me, this was an African bishop, in his diocese as a de-weaponization program. So he told me that people had come in, they heard there was going to be a meeting and they could express their views on their local parishes, and they came in prepared to make really clear statements. And he said the method itself opened up the space and slowly they laid their weapons down, he said. Now, for me, that's a crucial thing. One caveat, which is I don't think it allows us to do the deeper theological work that I was also saying we need. So conversation in the Spirit can't bear the weight of everything. And apparently, other discernment methods are available.
Apparently. So they say. Dominicans might have something to say about that. Indeed. So conversation in the Spirit, a powerful, effective method, particularly for building communion. But in transferring this to dioceses and parishes and so on, not always. Can I ask a follow-up question, though? What are the spiritual virtues or mindsets that we learnt that we needed for synodality?
May I still, also for a bridge? I think that is powerful, the method. At the same time, the method also asks for some further development. For example, it was in Latin America, many people named it and said, it calls for to see how do we deal with really controversial questions. How do we learn to name them, that we do not fall into a false ironism, so that they can be spelled out, but then how do we discern them? Arguments also are part of discernment in St. Ignatius. But how do we do it? It's not just to become, to practice rationalism, but to say the rational part, the intellectual part. God has gifted us with the capacity to formulate reasons for something, but also to listen respectfully in a common search for truth. That I think is still something to be further explored.
And I think most people found challenging. I mean, people said in the Synod they had to learn this, that they were coming to offer what they had as a gift, rather than trying to persuade people of your point of view. You share a gift, but you're trusting in a kind of a common wisdom to emerge. And at various points in the assembly, we had doesn't matter who, but anyway, Giacomo Costa, who was helping to lead the process, saying, look, don't be afraid of disagreement, enter into the tension of the disagreement and seek the overflow. He was using a word that the Pope liked to use, which is to say that, often when we have a position A and a position B, but we're invited to see that there is a position C which transcends both of our positions, which is a gift of the Spirit, but you have to sort of have the patience to kind of open yourself to that. Did you see that happening in the Synod?
Yeah, it's having done so many sociology projects that rely on the tools of qualitative interviewing to create a safe space that is confidential, whereby someone can share with immense candor what they really think. That in itself is a gift. Synodality is a step beyond that, because it's saying this is not a confidential space with just you, a recording that no one will hear, that you'll receive a pseudonym. This is you as you. And so I think one of the things that really struck me from the whole process is this elevation of dignity and respect for an other, including for someone who maybe has a different relationship to the church, a different role in the church, a different idea about their experiences, and creating a relationship and a space to be able to speak into those differences, as opposed to what we normally see, which is running so far away and not even be willing to name those key areas of controversy. So there was a sacred element that allowed the human to flourish.
Yeah, and I mean, it is worth saying this is a spiritual process. This is why this isn't quite like anything else. I ought to say the fraternal delegates, we had, is it 17, 18 this time round, that is to say representatives of other churches, Christian churches, were deeply impressed. They all said with the prayerful aspect of it. They were very struck by the silences, by the prayerful listening, which they often didn't have in their own traditions. Anna.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I became increasingly conscious of in using this method over so long from a spiritual perspective is how much we have secularized our understanding of speech, such that we it's almost like the politics of speech, which we live with and we breathe and we don't become conscious of, which is that the purpose of dialogue is something like negotiated self-interest. We've all become a bit Rawlsian in that sense. So what we think we're doing when we're speaking is asserting my view, negotiating the difference between another, moving beyond that. And I think this is testimony to Pope Francis and his constant reassertion, not just of the overflow, but of a theology of gift, which is that communication is gift exchange. And there's something about the method spiritually decenters the ego, it quietens the libido dominandi that's so present in that negotiated self-interest version of speech, and it placed us back into speech and communication as gift exchange.
Yes, got it.
And that's spiritual.
I believe also it is really a moment of grace. You do not produce it. We are so much used to produce things, but that is something we are all invited when we move into this space to let it happen, to contribute, but knowing that's God's Spirit will generate something which comes out of it, and that we need each other also for the discernment.
Can I just say very quickly that I want to emphasize what you said, what everybody said here, is that it really is a spiritual conversation, and you feel that, and we talk a lot about how new this is, and it's a new epoch in the church and all of the rest. But what I felt, what you take away is sometimes really how rooted we are in tradition. I think the moments of sort of peace and reflection and prayer within liturgical context, saying the rosary, doing all of the, mass, whatever it was, really what were just such a constant, regular part of the life of the Synod, that it really did put you in a different context and change how you thought and felt.
Brilliant. I have another question, but I feel I should now hand it over to you. Has anybody got a question they'd like to ask? Jonathan, if you could stand up, please, and wait for the microphone to get to you, say who you are, and keep your question brief. Thank you.
My name's Jonathan. My name's Jonathan Luxmore. I'm a journalist. I just thank you very much. It's been an absolutely wonderful panel discussion. I just wondered if I may to pick you all up on the very final point that was being made there about the experience of other churches who have long practiced synodality. I've been very struck that there's been very little discussion about this, at least that I've been aware of. The Orthodox churches have had this for centuries, as far as I know. The Anglican churches, particularly, including the Church of England, started it relatively recently in the 60s and 70s. And the discussion at the time was not 100 miles away from the discussion that we're hearing now about the need for listening and discernment. We must avoid party politics. But the argument now is that it is inevitable that in the fullness of time, you get party politics entering in. You get the formulation of lobbies and parties and coalitions, demand for the election of delegates and so forth. I wondered what is really going to prevent this from happening as time moves on?
Yeah. Actually, another way of asking the question is, were you aware in this process? No, let me rephrase that. What was the impact, or was there any impact of, as it were, external pressures and lobbies outside the process, which is really Jonathan's question. Do you feel that, as it were, they were resisted, or how were they dealt with? Anybody?
Well, let me just start. One way that they were dealt with, as you've talked about, Austin, is that one thing that Pope Francis said at the very beginning of the first General Assembly was that he wanted the delegates to see this as a sacred space, to not engage with journalists, to keep it sort of in the room, so to speak. And I think that there were many, as sort of someone involved in communications, that was their challenge, right? There were so many good stories in the room to tell. There are people from around the world who are just representing the church at its best, here to do something really, really remarkable. And so limits on that ability to share those stories was something. And at the same time, it really, to my mind, it was a learning process. I learned a lot from that my mind shifted on the way in which that sort of preserved a space for, well, everybody is aware of the very many people who have legitimate and understandable issues to share. It was a way of kind of keeping a sacred space while recognizing that world.
I mean, I'm not sure how we define lobbies, by the way, because it's a slightly controversial term, but I mean, what about say the women deacons movement?
So first of all, I want to say that the process obviously isn't just within the room, just within the General Assembly. It involves everybody. Everybody's participated. So people who came to Rome, who brought issues they were concerned about or particularly resonated with them, I think it's very important to recognize that that is a part of the process as well, and for it to be something that we hear from, as well as I think it's always most important to remember who's not there, whose voices are not heard, who don't have the resources to be there as well.
Yeah.
I mean, the entire process is predicated upon a high level of voice and inclusion. And so I think part of what made it possible to have the conversations in the Synod Hall were all the conversations that went into it, which were massively inclusive and spread the globe and the array of all the vast issues that Catholics are thinking through. And so we shouldn't be surprised either that Rome itself became really a laboratory to think through and feel that. And I think what I felt too, both in and out of the hall, is this massive level of interest and excitement and hope. And feeling as though this is a collectively shared experience. This is our church as a people of God. And so I think less of an insider outsider, more of a we are here together and this is a part of it. We're trying to understand how to speak into and through that.
I mean, my sense was that there was an attempt always to respect, as it were, the agenda set by the initial listening of the people. So I think that's what makes it different. Please.
Hello, my name is Pia Jolliffe. I'm a mother of 3 children and an academic here at Blackfriars. My question concerns who wrote actually the grassroots documents, because I miss the question of the family. The question of the church is, Vatican II teaches us that the church is God's family. And when we see this picture of the final picture that you mentioned with the Pope and everyone around, this is a family picture, this messy picture. This is how I feel in the kitchen with everyone around. But I miss the question of the family. Questions where I come from in Vienna that are actually everyone talks about is why can't divorced people who remarry not receive Holy Communion? Questions why can't priests have families, or why do they have to commit never to have families? Why is there no, and religious women as well, by the way, since we speak about women.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So what happened to those questions is your question.
The family.
Yeah, on family. So you've given 2 examples.
Not just bringing women in as deacons and priests, but family.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah.
Anna.
So interestingly, the more individualist West reports said less about the family, whereas Asia in particular and the African reports talked a lot about family. And interestingly, one of the questions about formation that arose in many of the grassroots reports was specifically about the availability of accompaniment and formation for family groups, so not just for individuals. And in fact, the Asian churches were able to share examples of really interesting good practice that they have that we simply don't have in the same way, particularly in European contexts anymore. So the question of the reality of family life in all of its complexity and reality absolutely was there in the grassroots reports, with some geographical distinctions in terms of the strength of that, but it is there in the final document. So there is a strong emphasis on the image of family, We chose to use a diversity of images, not one single image for the church, but the idea of the church as the family of God is also there present in the reports, as well as more concrete discussion of specific questions. And remember that the study groups, when they report, there is a study group that will come back to many of the questions that you've just raised about the reality of divorced and remarried Catholics, etc. So there's more to come as well as what's already in the documents. But the question of family was there.
Thank you. Another question, please. Over here, please. Catherine.
Thanks very much. I'm Catherine Peppenster. I want to pick up on a couple of things that Kim said originally, where she said that lay people, women and others have had a place at the table and going backwards should not be possible. So I want to ask to what extent you will feel confident that that is the case, or might the synodal process that we've seen become characterised as part of this specific pontificate rather than the church going forward? And I also wanted to pick up on what Kim said about the need to be more women in the room to cope with clericalism. That suggests that women are a sort of antidote to clericalism, but perhaps if you could explain if you think that's not the case, because if women do eventually have a role as clerics, does that mean they become clerical, or could they develop a different way of being clerical?
So first, let me do that second question first. I want to be clear: women can be just as clerical as anybody else. So that's obviously true. And I'm not speaking to, this is not about ordination or any of those questions. What I'm saying is that you have a culture where people who make the decisions are all wearing collars, and people who are involved in that decision are wearing collars. And that is just a particular culture that we all know of. Think about your own professional or university environments, where if that were the case, that would change the dynamic in the room. That it's simply the case that if you have more women in the room, as if you have more young people, if you have people of different races, if you have more diversity in a room, better decisions are made. So to me, that is part of changing the culture. I think one of the stories we learned from the sexual abuse crisis is that had more women been in the room, not that we wouldn't have had it, I don't want to say that, but simply that you would have had a different conversation around what the responses were. So that's what I meant about a response to clericalism. In terms of lay people having a seat at the table and not going back, that is my great hope. And that is my expectation, to be honest. I think that having had this experience, it's very hard to say that we will return to theater-style seating of prelates who will sit there and read. Remember what synods used to look like, right? Reading prepared documents and people falling asleep and going to the next one. I can't imagine going back to that in the same way. And I obviously I can't speak to what the future holds, but that would be my great hope.
Previous synods described by one bishop as like a transatlantic flight, but without the movies. Anna, is there a reverse gear for the synod? Could it be reversed in a future pontificate? Will it be?
I am a theologian, and therefore I believe that the good abides. And therefore I genuinely believe that there has been a good experienced in this process. The thing about the good abiding is sometimes it abides in unexpected ways and places. So I don't think we can predict how the richness and grace of this experience will transition into the future. Do I believe that there will be forms of creativity and co-responsibility of lay people and clergy together? I do, and I think it will be a direct fruit of these 2 to 3 years. Do I believe that means that the next synod with whoever may or may not be pope at that point, do I believe it will look exactly like this? I have not the faintest idea, and I don't believe anybody who tells me that they do.
No. Sorry, did you want to come in?
I believe it is also important to see where are there already good practices of synodality that exist.
Taking root in the church.
It can give us hope. For example, I participate, it's only one place, in the Ecclesial Assembly of Amazonia. So it's beautiful because there, yes, we prepare, make decisions together, but we are also involved in the taking of decisions because the bishops want us and say that it's done in community. We discern together and we come together to a consensus, and the decision then are also taken together, and each one takes it back to her local church to implement it with this commitment. So I think there are many also places where this is already happening, and we can be grateful for it.
So Synodality already taking root. I just want to add one thing to those excellent answers, which is sort of conclave politics. If you think that something like 40% of the cardinals who will elect the next pope have been present at these assemblies, I haven't really heard from any of them any desire to go back. Most of them see it as the future. And the other thing I want to say, and this is, I hate to think about the conclave, but, we have to. At the next conclave, it will be the first time that a pope will be elected against the backdrop of a historic consultation of the people of God that has gone through these stages. And I don't believe any conclave can ignore the fruits of that, but that's just my view. Any other questions? Please, Vera.
My name is Vera. I'm a graduate student in theology here. And Anna, you said that conversation in the Spirit will not do the theological work. Now we have theologians and a sociologist on the panel. What is the specific, distinct contribution that theology makes? Because the Pope seems to imply it's also meant to be a conversation in the Spirit, and there's a study group on that as well. But how is theology different from conversation in the Spirit, and what might be its contribution there?
Please. To start?
Yep.
So just one clarification. I'm not saying that no theology happens through conversation in the Spirit. My point was more that you cannot do all the work of theology through the method of conversation in the Spirit. And sometimes we hit upon a difficulty or a challenge where we needed either a different process in order to work through that question, or we needed a different kind of way of thinking about those questions and matters. And I do think, and that's why I highlighted the anthropological issues, that we need a space and level of attention to some of those anthropological issues that we have not yet had in quite the way we need it for our times. So I would like to see that there would be a renewed energy in a synodal way, in a synodal spirit, to work more deeply on those questions, because we will not give a credible witness to this age and this moment if we do not do serious work on those questions. Equally, from a slightly drier, but no less important in a way, ecclesiological perspective, there are also questions that Vatican II begged. For example, the way in which Vatican II treats the question of the laity, and half does that work, but only half does it. And the Synod throws up like the next stage of development of those ecclesiological questions left hanging, and it connects with these ministries and charisms questions. If we're going to answer the ministries and charisms questions more adequately, there is a whole piece of ecclesiological work that must be done around that, and that is to the service of the mission of the church. So conversation in the Spirit isn't going to do all that load-bearing work. That was simply my point.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, okay, one more question, please, at the back. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Father Claro Conde, Filipino from... I belong to Portsmouth Diocese, and I'm very much involved with the migrants and ethnic groups. I was touched by Sister Birgit, saying that we have been practicing synodality in Latin America, but as well as in the Philippines, with the basic ecclesial community, and also the small Christian communities in Africa. And there are many migrants now in UK, and they're participating very much in parish council and so on. And many of them have experienced synodality in the Philippines, the basic ecclesial community which I grew up in Mindanao. So I think the cross-section of the British and Africans and Filipinos and so on, can enrich the churches here with this synodality. But sometimes...
Okay. Did you have a question, Father? Just
the question, but sometimes, the question for us, some people here in UK, they feel being phased out, because of the activities and greater participation of the migrant community. What do you say about this?
So how does the Synod have to respond to people who, for example, feel threatened by migration? Okay. Anybody want to come in on that?
Well,
Can I just say very quickly, and then I'm sorry. First of all, I want to speak up for the United States. We have an experience of synodality, very rich, the encuentro process that's also been in the United States as well. And so it's true that synodality has been in many different areas of the world, as obviously in religious communities, there's an experience of it. And I think part of what we're doing here is making sure that is spread, it becomes much more the life of the church. In terms of migrants, I think one thing we have to say is when we talk about involving people who are on the margins, people who don't have a voice, people who won't normally be at the table, that is the community. As we turn to the next sort of epoch of our church, this is a prime issue. It's clearly a prime issue for Francis, and clearly something we have to think about more richly.
So a key mechanism for enabling the kind of understanding and integration of migrants into communities. Now, I'm going to take the last question in the last few minutes, and it's a question to all of the panelists, and it's about the communication of the Synod and what we do now. How well do you think we, the Synod people, have communicated the nature of what the Synod is to people? How well do people really understand what we've done? What needs to be done now to communicate what it is? Do you have any particular recommendations or messages to your bishops of your countries in respect of that? Who wants to go first? Kim, you're the communications expert.
So I would say this, in some ways, I think it's been very well communicated about, for instance, that I think everybody many people who've been involved in the Synod would know that the Synod is not a parliament. That's something we've heard from the beginning, and that we weren't going to resolve particular questions, but this is about a way of being the church. I want to say that some of those understandings of this have been well communicated. I think that it's very hard to communicate something like this across the people of God, and that what it will take to communicate it effectively will be a couple of things. Synod delegates going back and being leaven in their local churches and taking this experience back and communicating it well. Our network of networks that is the church, communicating it through ministries and universities and other kinds of institutions that take this and start to live it in our daily practices. But the final way that we can communicate this is not by talking, but by doing. Just starting to have the practice of synodality, however imperfect, whatever you think it is, just starting to have it where you are in your own time and place.
Anything you want to say to the US bishops? No, Kim, first of all.
Get started. Let's start doing synodality in our local.
Thanks. Tricia, what do you want to add to that, to your bishops?
Well, I think both to this question and the last one, this idea of place is really crucial, both the ways in which we are deeply contextualized and immersed in our own place, but also how we are on the move, migrants being a wonderful example of that. So being attentive to the ways in which our particular diocesan experience, our parish experience is going to shape synodality. But Catholics are also thinking of their lives and their connections beyond these narrow boundaries, and maybe even ways that we don't necessarily have structures to appreciate. So I think beginning to speak into the experience of individual Catholics, but helping individual Catholics to see themselves as a part of networks, as a part of this broader conception of what church is. And synodality gives both a language and a process, and I think en route to structures that can better enable those contextualized experiences.
Thanks, Tricia. Birgit.
From the Episcopal Conference of Latin America and the Caribbean, the theological group already met, and we saw in coordination with the bishops, it's necessary for us to make a popular version of the text because it's very long for our cultures, and to help the people to identify what are the main ideas and that they see how it connects to what have been all the ideas, the proposals of fruits of discernment they brought in, so that they see, yes, we have listened to them, and yes, it is taken up. Secondly, our people also said it, walk the talk. So to help the bishops to do some planning together, how do we start to put things into practice? And there further participation of women. For example, in theology, teaching, accompaniment, spiritual accompaniment, teaching of women also in seminaries. Also, the whole question of how do women contribute what you said, stronger images, language in liturgy, that these step by step will be done so that it gets rooted in our practice, in our synodal practice.
Super, thank you. Anna.
So there's all sorts of practical things that need to happen, including canonical things and all sorts
Just
of
give us a
very
couple.
practical.
Just a couple of practical things.
No, I actually want to say the opposite of that, which is, in fact, anything that grows our confidence in relational encounter with each other, anything that builds formation, serious formation at a wide scale level into our processes will be building and implementing, be building on what we've done and implementing. And the reality is that we're in a post-COVID moment right now where people are crying out for opportunities for real encounter with other actual human beings, for the formation and renewal of communities, communities that really foster lasting, healthy connections. This message in this moment is so timely that we simply have to find any way we can of living it. And that will grow what the document is truly about. Practical implementation, yes, but there's a spirit of it that simply needs to breathe.
Gosh, thank you so much for a fantastic panel, very, very rich discussion. Really grateful to all of your insights and your experiences. Please join me in giving them a round of applause.